Why do you, Aaron? Why do you see that as a problem? You know. Okay, good.
It's time.
Is it time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Oops. No. Okay, guys. Welcome back to the second session. And I've done a slight agenda bashing here. So we had one leftover item from yesterday, which got pushed to today. This is the TX-OAUTH summary. Dick is going to do that, then followed up by a short summary from Aaron about the site discussions on OAuth 2.1. Brian's next, Depop. Thorsten has two presentations on pushed authorization and rich authorization. And then Aaron is going to come up again and talk about the intermediary metadata. And then we have Travis with some claims discussions. That's all I have. Are there any other things that you would like me to bash in the agenda? Nothing? Cool. Okay, let me get the slides. Clicker.
Thank you. Hi, Mike.
Oh, wait, Tony, can you again describe these? Yeah, an award-winning scribe. Do we have Java? This was Ludwig was doing it last time. Ludwig, are you in the room?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Okay. Awesome. Thanks. There wasn't. I don't think there was anything yesterday, right, on Java, but still, it's good. You never know. Yeah. Thanks, Ludwig.
Are we good?
We are good.
Okay. Descartes, who was not at the TX-OAUTH BOSS? Tony, you took notes. So maybe you weren't there. Maybe that explains the notes. Okay, so for the people not there, quick summary. We talked about a number of issues. All right, it's right here. Passing the request via redirect has a bunch of limitations and security issues. There's an awful lot of BCPs and extensions, that it's complicated. You know, Justin put up this slide that just showed a whole bunch of the specs as being part of the issue. A number of new use cases were described. PSD2, IoT, user not present. Annabelle had some interesting slides about some types of interactions that are not covered currently in OAuth 2. And then there were two proposals presented. One of them, TX-OAuth, aka OAuth XYZ, potentially OAuth 3, versus sort of RAR, PAR that are really extending OAuth 2. The questions then are, do we pursue both of these, one of or the other of them? That's kind of one of the first questions that came up out of that, whether we want to talk about those questions. I guess, first of all, is any questions on sort of as a summary? People might have. No. Okay.
Because most people were there.
Well, there was 3 hands going up, so yeah. I was wanting to be inclusive. It's 2019, right?
Yeah. It's good. Yeah.
Do we want to have any discussion or talk about these questions? Okay.
Yeah. That's why we are here to have discussion.
Right? No one's going to the mic or anything, though.
Well, I mean, so I think one of the other kind of key outcomes from that is that we committed to having further discussion on TX-OAuth around what would if we were to pursue the new option of a 3.0, we were going to do that on TX-OAuth.
Right. But I thought since we're here, we could see if there's more thoughts around this working group or a new working group, if anybody had any comments around that. We had a TX side meeting this morning.
If I could finesse that, I mean,
sure.
I would ask if any folks have opinions on that, or if anyone has ideas or approaches that would help us to come up with the answer to that decision.
Right. So one of the conclusions we came up with in the side meeting this morning was we would want a different mailing list than the OAuth list for discussing a chunk of brand new work that wasn't an extension if we were to do that. And that otherwise it's hard to track for people. And probably have dedicated meetings to a big chunk of work. And then another question or potential would be to do a design team within the existing working group.
So there were a few folks at the BOF who raised their hand to who were willing to work on this topic. Now it's some time passed. Did you find some more people, or are the same type of people who are willing to work together? Or like how do we get this kick-started? Like who would lead the design team, and who would be willing to actually be on a design team to work on it, besides obviously the authors of the proposals, I hope?
Well, there was Torsten, who had his proposals, which were really an extension. So that seems kind of clear-cut work.
And we have presentations and hums later on that today.
Okay, yeah. And then but today we're not talking, I don't think that on the agenda today is XYZ TXOS stuff, right?
True.
Yeah.
True.
So the question is, would there be people that would work on that? Yeah. So.
Sorry, I got confused along the way. We're talking
Sure.
about a design team with what scope? I missed it.
So the question would be if we're doing TXOth, and if it was in the OAuth working group versus being a separate working group, would you do a design team for the TXOth work within the OAuth working group? Was that clear, or?
No, it is. I'm trying to parse what that means.
Okay.
Justin, Richard, just to maybe clarify a little bit, we had a side meeting earlier today. These were all brought up as potential avenues and options of where the work can be done and how the work can be done. This isn't saying that there was a bunch of people that said we should do a design team or something like that, but just that would be something that would be more directly applicable to the OAuth working group. There was a general feeling in the room in the side meeting, though, as Dick was saying, that it at least would need its own space, like its own mailing list to kind of keep the focus on that, whether that's an offshoot of this list or if it's offshoot of this group, working group, or a new working group or something else. There was a general feeling that would be a big enough piece of work that having its own discussion space is important.
Okay, I just want to make sure I'm tracking. We have an OAuth list, we have a TX auth list, and we're saying we need a third.
No.
We would use TX auth, like whatever, because it's like whatever that gets associated with, we would use TX auth.
Good. Sorry, in my head I was hearing the third list.
Sure.
And I was hearing
Sorry about that.
Yeah, I'll just summarize it again. If the TX auth work was in the OAuth working group, discussion for the TX auth work to be on a separate list, the TX auth list versus rolling it all back to the OAuth list.
It's Thursday. Thank you.
Okay. No worries. Well, if there's no other discussion, part of this was just to bring everybody up to speed and some of the summary around the side meeting this morning. Okay.
Thanks. Good. Thanks for sharing.
Mike Jones, I was waiting my turn. To your question of whether, if we do this work, which isn't, I think, a decided question, I said it is not a decided question as far as I know. I strongly believe that it should be in the OAuth working group because that's where the collection of domain expertise is, and in particular security expertise about what can go terribly wrong in protocols of this shape.
I'm confused. I feel like we're re-adjudicating a lot of what we talked about in TXL. So we want to get a sense of the room of where we think the work is going to get done, and that's the different conversation than we had at the BOF. Okay, keep going then.
So, Leif Johansson, I would argue that if we're going to do this in OAuth, then it, in practical terms, probably means 3 slots per week, and it will be quite a strain on the current working group, sort of the management resources of the working group. And that we may need to assign extra resources to cover that. OAuth seems to have enough on its plate as it is.
Comment on that. It remains to be seen if that new work starts, whether then existing work then slows down, because I could imagine that some of you, since we are talking about the same people here, that they may decide working on one sort of TX OAuth versus sort of the regular OAuth at some point in time, right? I would assume. You guys need to decide. Or do you want to push? You come up with an extension, push it here and push it there, or what's your thinking on that?
Yeah. Annabelle Backman, Amazon. I think it's pretty unlikely or unrealistic to think that work on OAuth 2.0 and its extensions is going to halt. The reason I think it's unrealistic that it's even going to significantly slow down, because people are working on those extensions to solve immediate needs they have. Those needs are not going to go away just because we started to think about a bigger, better way to solve these problems. So I expect that work to continue to, for some time at a similar pace, at least for the near future. So I don't really see this as 3 possibilities. We do one, we do the other, or both. I really see it as we do what we're doing now only, or we do both.
Mike Jones, to your question about, well, are we rehashing something? From my point of view, I was in the BOF. There was no conclusion out of the BOF to do new work. There's a question on the floor about, if we do this work, do we do it in the OAuth working group? And I think, again, because the security expertise is here, it should definitely be in the OAuth working group. If we do new work, there's a question to the ADs and the chairs whether that would involve a rechartering. I think it would.
It would. Yeah, I mean, absolutely, Mike. And 2, I completely agree with your assertion. We were inconclusive.
Thorsten Norderstedt. First of all, I would like to second Annabelle. So I wouldn't expect the work on OAuth to slow down. For myself, I'm accelerating right now because we have to solve problems at hand. So 3.0 is on a different timeline from my perspective. So I would assume us to work on both. Actually on 3 aspects. Because yesterday in a side meeting, we discussed 2.1.
Yeah, that's on the agenda next, yeah.
2.1. Potentially 2.5. I don't know. Because the extension we're going to talk about later won't be part of 2.1, right? And there is the TX off and 3. That's fine. I mean, in the end, people will prioritize, right?
Annabelle Backman, Amazon again. I wanted to respond to something Mike said as far as what is the open question. Asking, if we're going to do this work, do we do it in the working group? Doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because the working group doesn't really have a conclusive say on whether or not IETF is going to do the work. The working group might agree or disagree on whether or not it is work that we should expand the scope, recharter OAuth to include that work. But if members of the IETF demonstrate a need for the work, and there is consensus that the work should be done somewhere, then that happens irrespective of the opinion of this working group.
Justin, Richard, and I just wanted to address the point of getting the right expertise. I mean, I think it's a little bit of a red herring to say that if we were to start a new working group, we wouldn't have the right expertise, because all of us are in like dozens of working groups. I'm in dozens of working groups with a bunch of you across different standards bodies and within the IETF. We have a way of reaching out to the right experts and bringing them in. And I think that with something like this, if we were to do a new working group, or even to do a new mailing list, which again, I think is a good idea, we would want to make sure that those people are involved, that the right people are involved. There are some really, really brilliant people in this community that I think need to be part of this conversation. Additionally, I do think personally that it's because OAuth 2 is going to keeping on for quite a while, and we're going to keep extending it and keep, patching it and tweaking it and new security for it and things like that. I think that there is a slightly different audience for TX auth style work versus OAuth 2 style work with significant overlap. But there are going to be a lot of people coming to the OAuth 2 world that just want to care about OAuth 2, and they should be able to do that. And I think that's especially important because a lot of people raise the question of, oh, are we just going to confuse people by saying there's this new thing? Well, one way to not confuse people is to say, like, there is a new thing and it's being worked on here to do something new. So if you're interested in that new thing that's not done yet, sure, that's over there. Go alpha test, go beta test, right? It's the spec is not written yet. If you want to stay in the OAuth 2 space where things are more explored, then there is a space for that.
Thorsten, I think it's too early to really decide, because I honestly don't know what OAuth 3 is all about. And we also came to that conclusion in the morning. So we need a clear description of the scope of what OAuth will look like. I'm waiting for you just to refocus. So from my perspective, the next logical step would be to really write up a proposal for the scope of OAuth 3, and then we might decide as a community, as individuals, on how to proceed. I think that makes sense, instead of spending more time now, because I'm waiting to give my presentation.
So if I could summarize that feedback, you're reiterating that there's two questions to consider. There is, what is it that we need to do? And there's then the question of how is it that we're going to go forward with doing that? And these are certainly interrelated questions, but we need to be considering both dimensions. Okay.
Before asking my comment, I'm going to ask the chairs, based on based on that, do we want to simply table this conversation for the time being, pending more clarity on the scope of the TX auth work?
Yeah, it seems so that that's the right approach from the feedback we've just got.
Okay.
I would endorse that approach. I mean, I think we need to be, again, quite clear on what is it that we want to do. And I think by then enumerating and being kind of clear, crystal clear, whether it's, again, 2.0, 2.1, or 3.0, there's going to be a lot of things to do, and then we're going to have a conversation on what it is to do. I mean, the key question for me is, if we were to talk about a hypothetical new working group or a hypothetical recharter, one of the key things for me to be able to explain during that chartering process would be, if someone came to us with a new body of work and I was holding that right up, would it be clear how we would go about to do that work? Would it be clear if we had two working groups? It would certainly be clear if we had kind of one working group, which is not to say that's the right answer, but the key kind of distinguisher is, do we know how we go kind of through that? So I think we need to, bottom line, I think we would need to write down first what it is we want to do, and then we can engage in a conversation to how to split it apart or not at all.
Aaron Parecki from Okta. I just want to echo something I heard from the last meeting actually we had, which I haven't heard come up again in this discussion, which is that yes, there is absolutely going to be work on 2.0, 2.x continuing for a very long time. And the primary reason for that is that realistically getting people to move to a 3.0 is not something that's going to happen overnight by any means. So the work on 3.0 is more about long aiming for the future, trying to get something, in front of people, but sort of long-term planning rather than we're telling people to halt everything using 2.0 and switch immediately, right? So I think we just need to make sure that message continues to be something we get across. We're not saying stop using 2.0, 3.0 is better, but wait for us to finish it, because that doesn't make any sense and that would never actually work in the real world anyway.
So if I can summarize what I think I heard there was, we've talked about we need to describe what we're going to do. We're going to then need to talk about how we're going to do it. And it sounds like perhaps there's a third activity that's related to, regardless of what we choose to want to do, there's a communication we need to have, because there are all sorts of stakeholders that are watching different parts of this kind of activity. And we need to be crystal clear on the change we're talking about embarking on to make sure, we continue to have their active support and participation. Thanks.
This is Justin. I'll volunteer to take on the work item of taking a first shot at writing down what we want to do, and I'll run it by Roman as a sanity check, and then put that onto the TX auth list for discussion.
Sounds like a plan for me.
Perfect. Aaron, can you quickly summarize the discussions around 2.1?
Aaron Parecki again. So yesterday we had a side meeting about OAuth 2.1. The discussion was a very good discussion. The sort of high level end result of that discussion was that it seems like there is a pretty broad consensus on the idea that we need to do something to sort of clean things up. There was definitely an agreement that there is a lot of documentation to read. We didn't come to a conclusion on exactly how to proceed. The main disagreement stemmed from basically whether or not any sort of new document should be saying things that are effectively breaking changes to the spec. What I mean by that is not necessarily nobody was saying we're going to add new features in this, but by doing something like requiring the things that the security BCP recommends, that is effectively a breaking change to existing implementations, which technically don't have to follow the security BCP right now. That was the main disagreement. And we kind of came to the conclusion that we need to discuss those more on a case-by-case basis. I volunteered to take a first pass at writing up an outline for what a document could look like, highlighting the particular aspects that fall on either side of that line so that we can talk about them individually, because I think we agree that there was more to discuss there on the specifics.
So in terms of the changes, were you discussing as sort of a BIS document or because a BIS document indeed is not supposed to make breaking backwards but compatibility breaking changes. But removing, for example, optional features is not such a feature, or further detailing is also not backwards compatibility breaking.
The particular form of this document was not something that we have landed on a concrete definition of. So I think that remains to be seen what the actual form of that will take based on the discussions that we need to continue having.
So it sounds a little bit like we need some more discussion and find out what specifically will end up in a document, and then we can say, is this a BIS process? And a BIS can actually be also advancing it along the standards ladder, if you will, which would be useful, I think. Or it could be, like you said, the 2.1, something that is really different, slight or backwards compatibility breaking changes. Although .1 typically indicates that it's not, but
yeah, and maybe kind of a finer point in the discussion of what 2.1 would look like, was there discussion about using updates and obsoletes?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
There was definitely some discussion.
Did we have
about that.
some resolution on that, or is that more conversation? That's perfectly fine for you just to punt.
Was there a resolution on that? Go ahead.
There was a preference for updates in order to say that if you still want to do 2.0, do 2.0, that's fine. If you're doing 2.1, you're bound by these particular restrictions. There was a lot of, as Aaron was just saying, there was a lot of contention about what it would mean to be compliant with 2.1 and how you would be able to support 2.0 and 2.1 on the same endpoints or the same server or the same service, or like there's a lot of deployment questions that would need to be better understood when we start changing, shoulds into musts and adding new musts that didn't exist 10 years ago.
So to kind of make sure I can reframe that. So it sounds like what we're saying is we're preparing for an ecosystem based on this conversation that has 2.0 and 2.1, and we're going to make no statements about what they do with 2.0. We're just going to say we also have 2.1.
That was my read of it. And so if you want to still do 2.0, that's fine. You should follow the BCP, which will basically make you 2.1 compliant. Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds like a miracle to me, but
I'm not opening up that.
no, yeah.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. Just to add some more detail there, the concern or questions around how big or how small a change 2.1 is from 2.0 and challenges around managing or living in a world where we have that two protocol ecosystem is a lot of what is driving the remaining question of, do we actually do a 2.1 or are we doing a BIS, which is not a 2.1? So yeah, those questions are very much interwoven.
No.
Yeah, we're just reporting back from a discussion, and there are different opinions. So my opinion, and I restate that now, I would like to get rid of the security BCP. I would like to roll that up in a new version of the RFC. And if that obsoletes 2.0 features, fine with me, because we actually have a discussion around that, exactly. But we need to support, or we need to understand and to admit that there will be a world with 2.0 implementations running beside 2.1 implementations and even servers that support both. So from my perspective, we need to find ways to make that happen, right? So, and the 2.0 implementation can just RFC 6749 compliant from my perspective, right? So, but you need to be able in an ecosystem to, especially on the server provider side, to offer a migration path, which might mean that you have both versions in parallel running. And then we discussed, how could we determine what a client needs? Is it policy based, or is it have a different set of endpoints and so on? So I think there's a lot of stuff we need to sort out before we move forward. And we have right now, I think, different opinions on whether we should make breaking changes or not.
Sounds like,
Yeah.
Comment from the Jabber from Philip, restating that I mentioned at IETF104, the next major minor auth version is one that doesn't need a BCP.
Okay. But in any case, we are looking forward to see that discussion happening on the OWASP list. So if you could trigger that soon, I guess it will take a little while till we arrive at some common points. So happy that you volunteered to trigger that and lead that discussion. Awesome.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Brian.
Oh, sorry. So this is a little awkward to try to continue from off where I left off in the last meeting. I was going to try to start from the beginning and go a little faster when we get some slides up. So I'm here to talk about some prospective new work. It's an individual draft called Depop that is loading the slides for it.
Have you done performance engineering?
No, it's making progress. What did you put in there?
I put a lot of pictures in because that's what I do.
Did that one. You put photos in there, right?
Of course I did.
Oh man.
Just open it one more time.
It wouldn't- yeah, this one stalled. Yeah. And this one failed. Oh shit. It worked last time.
Or maybe the other one.
No, it's making progress now. You see?
Alright, how many 0 days are in this PDF?
Couple.
Nothing can happen to this fully grown.
I was gonna say.
There we go. Woo.
So it was this picture.
That was that one. There's more.
This is his 100 megapixel Hasselblad.
So real quick, it's a draft proposal for a new, hopefully simple and concise approach of proof of possession for OAuth access and refresh tokens. And the idea is to do it at the application layer using application level constructs and being able to leverage existing library support, specifically JWT around support. So this can actually be something that's implementable and deployable. A little history of proof of possession. The main motivations are to do something, be better than bearer. We've had bearer tokens for a long time. We've had a lot of attempts to do better. Some worked out better than others. Mostly, though, we don't have something that's widely applicable. This is partly motivated by the security BCP, which rather aspirationally says that you should use sender constrained tokens. I say it's aspirational because really there's not a lot of good options to do that right now. And I say like that we lack really a suitable or at least suitable and widely deployable and applicable POP mechanism. This is especially true around single page applications because the one thing we do have that's almost an RFC is the mutual TLS stuff. The user agent interaction and usability experiences doing MTLS in the browser are pretty much a non-starter for most deployments. It just doesn't work. Token binding, I know I got really excited about it, maybe too excited, but it's just not, it's not panning out. So here we are again, trying again, hopefully with some lessons learned. And another thing that's come up in SPAs as well as mobile applications is a desire to be able to do proof of possession around refresh tokens as well for public clients to give a little bit stronger possession there. So the basic flow is we have this mechanism, which we're calling a depop proof. And it's just a new HTTP header. It's the same, it looks the same on all requests, both to the authorization server and to all protected resources. It flows with the actual token request, usually a code exchange or whatever, to the authorization server. And it provides the public key and some limited proof of possession of the corresponding private key. In turn, the authorization server can bind the issued access token to that public key, send it back, and then when it uses it at resource access, it provides the exact same style of proof on each resource call in conjunction with the access token that's bound to that public key, and that's an extra check that the resource server can do. So that, is there any way you can kill that top piece? Yeah. Thank you. The proof, depop proof JWT is a JWT. Here's what it looks like on the inside. The header atop here, it's got some explicit typing because that's a thing we do now. Asymmetric only algorithm support, and then the public key in JWK format in the header. So, and this is the key that signed it, and the public key is there. So it's basically just saying, hey, here's a JOT. I signed it with this key, and you can know that because you verify the signature. It's just showing possession of that key. And in order to kind of give that proof of possession some meaningful context, we try to associate it with the HTTP request in a sort of minimal fashion, enough to make it relevant, but not enough to be difficult or error prone or hard to deploy with all the fun and pain that comes with trying to deal with normalization and signing of HTTP requests. So we've got a JTI claim in here that's sort of encouraged but not wholly required to use for replay checking. And then we've got some minimal information about the HTTP request itself, including basically just the request URI with no query or any other parameters, just the host and path and scheme, as well as the method that was used. and then the issuance time of the token so that the server has some understanding of how fresh it is and can enforce some window of validity there. And there could be other stuff in there, but that's the defined set of claims right now.
Justin, Richard, just really quick, has there been thought about how extensible that body should be? I realize POP's only doing that, and that's fine. Is there any thought about sort of what the namespace of a dpop plus JOT payload could have in it if somebody had something else they wanted to cram in there?
Not beyond like
not past what's there.
Other stuff could go here.
Okay, that's fine. That's
and
fine.
and
Thank
some
you.
mention in the draft now that sort of says as much like you could do more, but there's no explicit provisions for what that would look like.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Ludwig Seitz, quick question. Any specific reason why replay checking would be optional?
So if you've followed some of the conversation on the list recently, there's potentially some deployment issues at scale, depending on how your architecture is, for ensuring that the one-time use of tokens is timely and accurate. So you might be checking that validity, you might be checking that sort of store of IDs in a large cluster with an eventually consistent backend to store that. So we've made some provisions to allow for things that aren't tightly transactionally oriented that could have really negative impacts on the system as a whole, as well as you might choose to only track those within a local system only and sort of trade off the cost benefits of this. Considering, again, these are things that might only be valid, the server might only consider it valid for the order of a few seconds. There's a large continuum of sort of the level of security you can get to versus sort of the performance and the usability of this, and we've it might not be the right place, but we've tried to sort of pick a meaningful spot in the middle that provides that utility without being too cumbersome to implement or deploy. And so one last thing, by optional, I don't say it's optional, but it's a should, and it's actually a must in other place with a caveat of within reasonable considerations for performance and consistency.
Thorsten, as a co-author, I just would like to add that you can get different levels of replay detection, right? If you don't do the GTI, you get replay detection if someone wants to use the header with a different resource server. And if you put into the GTI, you get the replay detection if that's replayed on the same resource server. I think that's a good distinction.
Yeah, and furthermore, it's on the same resource server at the same path, at the same method in the order of a few seconds. So it's narrow.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. We talked in the previous session about the coming work for HTTP message signing, so I'm not going to go into that any more than just reminding people that that work is happening and may be applicable here. Separate from that, from the conversation on the list, it seemed pretty clear to me that it would be helpful to have a clear statement of what the threat model is for what we're trying to mitigate here with Depop, because the more of these things that you strip out, the more this just becomes another bearer token that you're putting in the request. So it would really be helpful to understand, once we strip all of that out, are there threats that we are actually still mitigating here? Or have we just produced something that ends up making people feel safer than they really are?
Yeah, some tightening up of that I think is warranted. Well, as with all things, it's hard because I think everyone has a little bit different idea of what that is, and the push to change this is, there's different competing interests, but there definitely needs to be some tightening up of the objectives around the threat model and what we're trying to prevent.
And if there are competing interests, then that does argue for a more flexible model that
it argues for it, but I don't know that it wins that argument.
Well, we have to have that argument.
I very much want to avoid a situation where the client is in the place of saying what is signed in this token. because it has a lot of ramifications on how do you negotiate what that is, what are the properties of that actually provides. And if we can't talk about it, and I know we had a hard time yesterday talking about exactly what you get from what, I'm wholly unconvinced that the average client developer can make a reasonable decision about that.
The client doesn't have to, the resource server does.
Well, that would then assume that you have some sort of discovery and metadata indication to say what particular aspects of the HTTP request are signed in the context of this resource
That
server.
would be the API documentation for the API you're calling.
And those are the things I'd like to avoid. Again, going back to this is meant to be simple, easily deployable, not a lot of options.
And if the scope of this is to be usable specifically and only within the domain where you're in a pure discovery world and you're talking up to standardized APIs on completely standard interfaces, then I understand why you would not want to be in that place where you have to negotiate that. But the practical reality is that OAuth is used for all sorts of things that aren't just standardized APIs. And in those cases, people have documentation for their APIs that describe what needs to be, how authentication authorization happens. Part of that can, and if they're using something like this, should be an indication of these are the things that need to be signed in order to protect this request.
It definitely could be, but it doesn't have to be. And one of the value of standards is avoiding the need to look up that stuff either in documentation or in dynamic discovered sort of metadata. So
sure, I'm simply saying that there is value there is value in that flexibility. There are strong use cases for where you're actually specifically stating what you're going to include and what you're not, and there are strong use cases for standardizing the format and allowing implementations and deployments to say, this is what I need covered and this is what I don't. Both of those use cases exist, and I think we'd be remiss to support one at the expense of the other.
Noted.
Yeah,
I disagree.
Yeah. One last thing based on discussion on the list. I believe you or maybe it was Neil, somebody in that conversation said that that CPU cost of asymmetric crypto was not a concern at scale. And I wanted to just state my disagreement with that. We have use cases where the time and cost of asymmetric crypto versus HMAX is absolutely a concern.
Okay, I don't think anyone said it wasn't a concern.
Well, we had that discussion earlier, like when Annabelle presented it and when I talked about the existing documents and there be a symmetric key mechanism, we had that discussion. But let's ignore it for the moment. We can go back to those if you want.
Yeah, well, I think the more recent discussion was around the relative trade-offs, whether the simplicity of not managing a symmetric key distribution environment and all the other things that come with that were worth the trade-off for public key.
Perhaps
not that it wasn't
perhaps I misread or misinterpreted, but what I saw was that there was a claim that that scaling was not a concern for asymmetric crypto. And
I mean, I said
like I said, I may have misinterpreted that. So if so, then
okay.
Then we're in agreement.
I said it could scale out because of the nature of it. But it didn't mean that there's not CPU costs, but only that it could scale.
Yaron Sheffer, back to replay. I think it would be simpler to always have a JTI, always have a random JTI, and leave it to the server as it should to do replay protection.
That's the current state of the draft. There's just been some.
Because you did mention missing JTIs.
I didn't mean it that way. I meant that it is required always from the client perspective. There's a bit of wiggle room about just how strict the server needs to be with it, but it's always required to be there. And the server is supposed to, I guess you could say, make a best effort at replay protection.
Thorsten, speaking as a co-author. First, reflecting on Annabelle's question regarding the threat model. It's being documented. It can be found in section 2. So it refers to the threat model that's documented in the security BCP. And I think generally, we need to keep in mind the scope and the objective of that draft. I stated that yesterday. I do it again. This is a stopgap measure. This is not intended to be, at least from my perspective, as a general means to do POP in the OAuth world, because we've got another mechanism, MTLS, and it works very well. This one, the original objective was to find something that works for SPAs that wants to use access tokens in the browser. Please keep that in mind. We can change the scope, but then we need to consider the consequences. But that's the reason why we started that work.
This is Justin. With what Torsten just said, and brought up yesterday in mind, the scope and the threat model is not clear from the current doc. So if we bring this in as a working group item, then that's going to have to be very, 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 very clear, because I think a lot of the discussion that's happening right now is because this feels like it could be, the resurrection of the whole OAuth POP infrastructure, and that had all kinds of features like the server being able to provision keys to clients and symmetric crypto and all of this other kind of stuff, which aren't part of this. I think that this would benefit from a narrower focus, like, for example, Pixie had. Pixie was about, public mobile clients protecting the auth code flow because they don't have client secrets. And by the way, here's how you do it. Turns out Pixie's a lot more useful for a lot more than that. And we're using it everywhere for lots of different things because it was a reasonably defined mechanism that found other uses. This right now doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like it's a specific point solution or stopgap, as Torsten said. So if we're to go forward with this, and to be clear, I like Depop. I think it's a really clever way to have the solution, and I've implemented all these header processing things and stuff like that. I like this, but if we want it to stay focused, it needs to be presented as focused in the text and in the working group. We're not there yet. I think we could get there if we decide to bring this forward.
Aaron Parecki from Okta. I don't mean to hone in on a specific point again, but just to echo what Annabelle was saying, and relaying comments from people at Okta, there is definitely some concern around the asymmetric only keys. And I know that a lot of my team there would not deploy it if it was asymmetric only and would rather see a symmetric option. So because of the speed concerns there. So just wanted
Aaron, keep in mind that we still actually have a working group with item with the symmetric version as well. So in that sense, we're fine. Of course, when Annabelle presented her work, I asked her whether it would make sense to align that what she presented, because it was slightly different in terms of header fields, etc. But that may be an option. But what I hear from numerous presenters on the microphone now is that you want something very specific need, and not a generic mechanism. And I think, is that correct? Or you want something else? But yeah, okay.
Well, I gave the specific example of the spot type applications, and but as maybe echoing sort of where Justin came from, oftentimes a specific point solution can be generalized into something more. And so from my perspective, I'm trying to make this something that can be a reasonable, deployable, usable POP option for access and refresh tokens.
The way how we came here was we had a working group item, or still have one, that has a symmetric and an asymmetric variant. And then you guys started this new effort because the argument was the other one is too complicated because it contains the symmetric, the asymmetric, and refers to some generic HTTP signing, which now interestingly is being entertained now, which is And now you are saying, oh, actually, we could extend it to something more generic. That doesn't make sense to me. Right? That's what you just said. Nodding. Okay. Good.
So no, I'm not saying it could be extended to something more generic, or I'm not pushing for that. I'm hearing people say it should include a symmetric key option. I'm saying that there's a very serious trade-off with that.
Okay.
In that this is simple because it relies on public-private keys. I understand the concerns. I don't know. I'm not saying it's not a done decision, but that's why it's this way. That's why it can be as simple as just the client presenting this header every time. Because we're not negotiating keys. That's why you get a particular security property of not being able to replay that across resource servers, because you don't have to distribute the symmetric key and get in the situation where the resource server can then impersonate another one because it has access to the symmetric key. So that was sort of the driving bit of this. There are people that want it to be something different. We're in a working group. We have to work through that. But so I'm trying to respond to different comments and different desires for things. One of the reasons, the document you keep talking about has symmetric and asymmetric key options, but it's strictly key distribution. It doesn't do the actual token presentation and proof of possession part, which is right another reason that it's not useful.
Yeah, well, it had that just in a separate document, which this was Justin's document, if you recall, which I think now with all the work we made its way into the at this meeting, adopting. This was what Annabelle was talking about. Is that, or is it a modified cabbage combined with something? It's an evolution of that.
More of that.
Yeah. But there the idea was to separate out the key distribution from the presentation in two separate documents. That was a decision at that time. Good approach. I don't know.
I've got another comment from Jabber, again from Philip, and he basically is underlining or stressing what Torsten said. Let's not forget the initial scope. Urgent need to be solved, the sender-constrained SPA tokens.
John Bradley Ubico, one of the co-authors. So again, with scope, our initial plan in the working group and discussions were we were going to use token binding to sender constrained tokens for single page applications. Some people over here that I'm pointing at may have screwed up that idea. What? Well, not Dirk. He's actually on the good side. But and we may eventually get token binding when Microsoft and Google sort things out and we cats and dogs live together happy. So given that might not happen in the next short number of months, we at the OAuth security workshop, we said, okay, what can we do for a single page application since we don't have token binding in the near future? And the answer was, okay, you could use web crypto and have the browser make a key pair and do a very simple signing operation. So this is really only intended to deal with that single page application mechanism. So I don't know whether, given that we're talking about single page applications, whether the performance issues are really all that concerning. These aren't high speed, high volumes clients, server clients that are talking to APIs. For other applications,
that doesn't make any sense. But
for native apps and host-based applications, they should be using the mutual TLS proof of possession because that does have better scaling options. So this isn't intended to deal with all the native apps, all the server-based clients. This is really intended for that subset of single-page applications that need to sender constrain their tokens.
Justin again. So what if this were adopted with the very narrow, very specific scope and all of the other fancy bells and whistles go into OAuth 3? it's yeah.
Sure. Which fancy bells and whistles? The ones that are being suggested, or
yeah, key
or
negotiations
ones that are here,
and all of this kind of stuff, and sort of general proofing mechanisms and things like that. While I agree with Annabelle that, you know, if the timescales were better, this ought to be using the general purpose HTTP signing mechanism. Yeah, that's probably going to be a while in cooking. But you know, because this is a very, if this can be a very specific thing, then I think that it's not going to hurt if this exists and other solutions also exist. So if there's a, you know, SPOP for symmetrical proof of possession or whatever, then great. You know, if there's something with the next major revision of OAuth that lets you do all kinds of different keys, or goes back to the OAuth key distribution architectures where, you know, servers are distributing keys and binding them to client credentials and all of that other kind of stuff, great. I mean, and you know, this existing doesn't make mutual TLS go away. It's very OAuth 2 to add another thing to the already gigantic menu to let people choose from. That's
true.
And yeah, and we are not done adding to the menu was the heckling from the back. This is not a value judgment. This is a statement. If you want the value judgment, talk to me after. But for real though, having this be like, this does this one thing, I think fits.
Annabelle, just having looked back over the Depop spec, if the intention is really that this is specifically driven at SPAs, that really needs to be cleared out, or that really needs to be called out more clearly in the draft, because it really isn't right now. You've sort of, if you read between the lines and knowing that, you know, that's what the authors are saying in forums like this, then you can kind of see it, but without that, it's really not clear. Separately, back to the asymmetric crypto scaling question. Everybody's focusing on latency, but that's only one aspect of scaling. If you have a service that is taking millions of requests a second, that little bit of CPU time adds up. And all of a sudden, you're running your service becomes a lot more expensive. So yeah, that may not, you know, one request taking a tiny fraction of a second longer may not, you know, impact the end user's experience, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's scalable. The other thing to consider is scenarios where you're making lots of these requests in the course of fulfilling one end user request. So our one end user operation, it's, you know, not necessarily just one hit here, it could be multiple.
Mike Jones, Microsoft.
This is where I stopped last time.
Mike Jones, Microsoft. Microsoft internally currently has deployed the old OAuth HTTP signing draft that expired 2.5 years ago, because we need application level signing given the failure of token binding to ubiquitously deploy. We would like to use this for all flows, for all client types. And please, let's not do anything that prevents that from working.
Thorsten, in answering or reflecting on what Annabelle just said, I understand that. I know that the CPO cost for asymmetric is, I think, 2 orders or 3 orders of magnitude higher. I think there are other ways to cope with that than using asymmetric crypto. We have at least 2 architectural options, and they are documented in the SPA BCP. One of them is not to use access tokens in the browser and rely on web security mechanisms to protect the lag to the backend. And also in the latter case you just talked about, having a lot of requests being executed on behalf of the user, yeah, just set up a backend and let that backend fire all those requests, and it uses TLS. So I think this is a much too narrow focus discussion yet. Yeah, just my thoughts.
Annabelle, again, echoing, I think what Mike said just was really a response to that, that as a service provider, we really don't want to have to operate significantly different authorization mechanisms across our ecosystem if we can avoid it. And forcing that on people is not the way to get them to adopt things. Separately, I feel like you're telling people that they should architect their application such that it fits the model or the constraints of your authorization mechanism, which seems wildly backwards to me. Like, people build SPAs that do not have backends, but need to make lots of requests to other services. That use case exists. If you're not going to support it, then that's fine. Just acknowledge that this is not going to support that use case, but we should be intentional about making that decision.
So Brian, can I ask you a question? You've heard a lot of feedback at the mic line. What is the one or two questions you need resolution on from the working group?
I don't think I can say, because there's quite a bit of feedback from make it very narrow to make it do all this stuff. Well, to be honest, there's a lot of competing interests and desires here. So I guess
do you now know why we came up with this broader thing?
I think
you went in a group at that time. I think that's the problem. Yeah, it was. What should we figure out in a group to progress this?
Well, I mean, I guess the first question is, do we want to progress it in the group? Because Torsten.
Just my guess is, and that it was popping up in my head a few seconds ago, I think we need to have a consensus in the group whether we want to rely on TLS-based mechanism for sender constraining. Because all the discussion now, I have feared from the contributions from Mike and Annabelle, to me, point in a completely different direction. I mean, right now, we are unable to provide a TLS-based mechanism for sender constraining for all kinds of clients.
No,
we draw the conclusion from that. We need a stopgap measure for those that cannot really use MTLS, which are SPAs. Now the discussion is turning into, oh, we have that mechanism, let's make it a general purpose mechanism for all kinds of clients. And then I understand the need for symmetric cryptography and so on and so on and so on. So from my perspective, we don't have a real consensus around how we want to implement sender constraining.
No, I see it slightly different. We have several solutions for sender constraint. One is token binding, one is MTLS, and one is a mechanism based on the application layer, or several mechanisms based on the application layer. We just haven't. We like the MTLS because that's why we worked on and published it. But we know its limitations. We also like token binding. We're just sad about its lack of deployment. And now we need to sort of make some progress on the application layer stuff, which we failed to make progress on. And partially because we can't agree exactly on what credential types to support, how the details look like, what to sign, what not to sign. And that has been a challenge in the past over years. And so here we are.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I've just phrased it differently.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, good.
Mike Jones, I believe that Microsoft's viewpoint is MTLS is great in certain constrained environments, such as financial APIs, but it is virtually undeployable in general purpose consumer applications. Therefore, we felt, given the existent threats about stealing bearer tokens, that we need as an industry to develop an application level proof of possession mechanism that works across the board for access tokens, refresh tokens. We're hoping that this will be that.
We are running a little bit out of time on the agenda, so that took us a little bit longer than we were hoping. And I think before Annabelle, Thorsten, Annabelle is cut the line here. Okay. So the chairs will work with our esteemed AD to find a path forward on this, how to advance this topic, because it feels we are a little bit stuck on that issue. But I'm positive that we find something out rather quick. Yeah. So expect a virtual intro meeting. Yeah. Given what we just heard, I would say not really.
I think we're going to take a minimally.
Yeah, we take that. Yeah, we talked this.
Yeah, just the last comment I had was, from my perspective, even for our SPA use cases, Depop would not work for us.
Okay. We'll work this out, Brian. Sorry that you didn't manage to get any further. There must be something magic on this slide. Probably that's
it's a really good slide.
Yeah, it didn't even load past that point.
All right.
Okay, sorry about that. Got stuck a little bit. We had. Oh yeah. So what was that? Thorsten. Okay. How do I get that back? Okay. So close this one.
Thank you, Brian, for presenting the Depop work. Really appreciate that.
This one, you pushed authorization?
Yeah, I would like to start with another, small addition to another small addition to another small addition to OAuth. It's pushed authorization. That's the clicker?
Yeah.
All right. So basically, the problem the small addition to a small addition of OAuth wants to solve is this. That's the kind of authorization requests we are seeing in the wild when you use some of, for example, OpenID Connect mechanisms. You're ending up with a really, really bulky authorization request URL that's sent through the user agent. And it poses some challenges. First of all, it's lengthy. That has impact on the latency, on the robustness. But there's also no mechanism for integrity and confidentiality protection, which might be relevant, especially if you pass transaction-specific values or constraints regarding the authorization process through that channel. We have got a solution, at least a partial solution. That's the extension to OAuth that we are going to extend. It's the JOT secured authorization request, which I hope will be published soon. It provides security for the authorization request by providing a mechanism to sign the request objects. And it also has a mechanism to path a request URI into the authorization request if you don't want to pass all the data to the user agent. And what we do now, we provide a mechanism to upload the payload of authorization request to the AS and to obtain a request URI to then use the draw mechanism request URI to send that data to the AS. So from my perspective, that's just the next step to bridge that gap. And that's how it's going to look like. So there's just a small change with step 2. So the client first sets up the authorization request in a direct post call to the AS. And the AS somewhere stores this payload and returns a URN to the client. And that URN then in turn is used in the front-end call to the AS. All right, so how does it look like on an HTTP level? That's a traditional OAuth request, so it's a GET that's sent from the user agent to the to the AS authorization endpoint. What we do is we define a new pushed authorization endpoint with the AS, and it takes the same parameters in exactly the same encoding and sends it via post request. That's the modification. And what you also see on that request, you can easily authenticate the client. And the draft says, use the token, or the AS uses the same token endpoint authentication method that's set up for the client to authenticate the client for that request, which also means you can only refuse to serve that client, for example, because the client is not authorized to access or request a certain scope, which adds a lot to the security of the protocol. Because then in the authorization endpoint, you know, I have actually authenticated that client before the authorization request hit my authorization endpoint. That's really cool. Yeah, and then the AS returns a request URI, and the request URI is not intended to be used as a way to obtain the authorization data by any external system. It's just a reference. Could have been an opaque identifier. I would assume XYZ does it with an opaque identifier. We just decided to build on top of jar, and that's why it is a URN. And that URN then is passed in the authorization request. And the AS is supposed to use that URN to look the authorization request up in a database and then just proceed. Question?
No, Justin Richard, just for quick clarification in XYZ. So yeah, keep it on this slide. The main difference between the way that this works and XYZ is that what you get back in XYZ is that entire URL and not something that the client composes. Otherwise, it is very much the same pattern.
Yeah, we stripped it down as far as possible, but wanted to be compliant to the rest of OAuth. And there's another option, which is to actually send a signed and potentially encrypted request object via the same channel. So instead of using the payload we are familiar with from RC 6749, use the payload as being defined by jar to send the payload to the AS, having the advantage you can do application level crypto, for example, to do non-repudiation. The result is the same. You get a request URI and you send that request URI to the AS. So those are the two different modes that we have spec'd out. The advantages of the solutions are it's a really robust solution for sending even larger authorization request payloads to the AS, which are relevant in all the use cases I'm working on currently. And I think I described that on Monday. And there's also a significant improvement in security for, from my perspective, relatively less cost, or few cost. Because you've got the integrity, confidentiality, and authenticity protection of TLS. You've got the client authentication upfront of the authorization process, which also means you can authorize the client. And Daniel's Fett's feeling is that it's resistant against mix-up attacks. And that's, from my perspective, better than having some systematic analysis of other people. So the analysis is still ongoing, but we are really confident about that. And early experiences show that's really easy to use. I'm starting with the developers of the ASs, because some ASs already have implemented that, and that did really quickly. And that also guided a bit the way we wrote the specification. And it turned out that the logic that's being executed at the authorization endpoint and the logic's being executed at the token endpoint can be combined in a pipe. That's at least what Philippe, for example, told us. I mean, if you have come up with different experiences, let us know.
Let you know now, or
as you like.
Okay. Justin Richard, just to add, so I have, yeah, I know we gotta hurry up. So we did implement this spec as part of Auth-Leet's next revision. And while we weren't able to completely combine the auth endpoint, we were able to abstract a lot of the processing. And I can state that this is pretty easy and sensible to do on an existing established AS platform.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Annabelle Backman, Amazon. First of all, I just want to say I think this is like a no-brainer for the working group to adopt. I definitely think we should do this.
Okay.
Are we still friends, Torsten?
Why not?
Now again.
Because you don't like my ideas regarding SPAs. I can live with that.
I did want to ask about how, or have you thought about how this would mix with the device flow, and if there's an opportunity to align the two of those? Because
it's an excellent question. But I just out of the top of my head, I fear we are running into XYZ territory, and I don't have concerns going that way, but I think you will end up with a more conversational protocol. And that's not the way OAuth 2 is designed to work. But we should definitely take a look into that. And I would also include SIBA, even if that's not IETF stuff.
Yeah, I haven't read this too closely, but it seems like there might be an easy way to integrate to get it to play well with device flow. Yeah, we'll have to take a look. That could easily like blow things up potentially.
I thought about that also. So if we can find ways, let's make it simpler in the end.
I'll take a look.
Don't go and engineer it now because we are running terribly out of time.
Yeah.
Okay, can we?
Ludwig.
Justin, just to reinforce what Torsten just said, when you combine PAR, the device flow, SIBA, the FAPI stuff that predated this, UMA, all of those sort of staging intent things into one protocol, you kind of do get XYZ. That was the idea. They are not as compatible as they seem on the box, unfortunately, due to the nature of OAuth's conversations.
Yeah. Okay. So as I already mentioned, there are implementations out there. I counted 5 of them. So my last question is, would the working group consider to adopt that as a working group document?
I'm going to ask for Ham. Please, Ham, if you think that we should adopt this document as a starting point for the working group. Please, Ham, if you can, please, Ham, if you object to making this a working group item. Okay, that was clear, strong positive response to the Ham. Thank you, Torsten.
Yeah, can you just
switch? Sure.
Okay. That was the warm-up.
Well, this
time check.
You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes? That reminds me on the first presentation of the JotSign for introspection response that I did remotely. So honestly, 2 minutes?
Yeah, we have another presentation.
I didn't screw up the agenda. Not really. I was part of it. Okay. All right. Then I talk about, just briefly talk about the problem, the proposal, and we'll ask you to adopt the draft. Right. So the problem is about, I would say, complex authorization processes. Tony, I try as best as I can. Complex authorization processes that need more data that you can today pass in a scope. So let's assume you have a payment API. The merchant wants to send a payment or get some money. The question is, how does the resource server know that the user actually authorized that this merchant is allowed to get that money? And that's the key question that drives the rich authorization stuff, because in the end, the authorization server needs all the information to render that user consent, right? So, and that user consent contains transaction-specific values, is rather complex and has context. And the short form of that presentation is, we have come up with a proposal to allow clients to specify this kind of more complex authorization requirements in a structured way. We use something that I was initially calling structured scopes, but Mike asked us to not use the scope terminology. So we came up with the authorization details name. So it's an array. You can bump into that JSON objects that are specifically designed for the needs of a certain API. That's why they are typed. So the AS can differentiate what type of authorization request object is that. Can I combine them? Can I do not combine them? You can combine them. You can send them everywhere, or you can use a scope. Yeah. It's in the 3rd revision. We've got some positive feedback, even on the list from people that are new to our community. I just put in a citation here from a guy from Mozilla. I think he's on the line as well. There are 2 implementations already existing at Authlead and the prototype at yes.com. I would like to consider you to adopt that as a working group item.
So who has read the document?
I should mention Justin and Brian are co-authors of that document. That tells you something, right?
That's yeah, because you may have just written it. So yeah, how many non-authors have read it? Yes, 3. Kind of half hand 4. Okay. That's good.
Ludwig,
think we
are
will,
people
we
in the
will do
call that read the draft?
I think we will do a call for adoption on the list and give people a chance to also sort of provide some feedback and so on. But I think that's good stuff.
2 more from Jabber who read the document.
Who are those?
3. Daniel Fett, Matthew De Haast, and Steinar Num.
Okay.
All right.
So thank you.
Cool. Yeah, we will do that. Tony, did you capture that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Perfect.
No one read it.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry, Travis, that we have.
8 minutes. 8 minutes. Okay. Well, I'll get started even before the slides came up. We've been talking in various venues, various places about this problem that Torsten just talked about, and I've been proposing a different solution to the problem. And to make that a little bit more tangible, I wrote it down as a specification. I've been proposing that problem can be solved using the claims request parameter from OpenID. But the pushback that I get is that, well, that's bound to OpenID, and a lot of people want to do API security only using OAuth. And so in this draft, what I've done is I've lifted that out. So here you can find the link to the draft. Lifted that out of OpenID and made it usable for API access using just OAuth. I've explained how we can use this in non-OAuth or non-OpenID Connect flows. I've stipulated how the input can work not only on browser-based flows like authorization and implicit, but also the output, which is something that's missing from OpenID. The draft has additional examples that aren't found in OpenID, some defining, some clarifying terms, and then the entire specification or the draft specification is compatible with OpenID. Aaron, I see you there, but I've got 19 slides in 8 minutes. Is it okay if we wait a little bit? Because I might even address your point. So just to know what we're talking about, if you've ever seen an authorization request like this, where we have the claims request parameter, which is even like Torsten's example he just put up, this is what we're talking about. So it's basically a query asking for certain claims to be asserted by the AS. So the terms that I mentioned, we're using claims, claim name, claim value from the JOT specification, essential from OpenID, but rewritten so that it's not bound to the end user, and some others that are defined in the draft. Importantly, claim sync, claims request object. These are things that exist abstractly in OpenID but aren't given a specific name. So a claim sync, what we mean by this is the part of the request that the client is saying, this is where I want the claims to be asserted. I want them to be included, for example, in an access token. A client might say, I don't know. I want them to be asserted, but I don't know where they're going to go. So it might just say the claim sync is question mark, or it might say I want them in every destination. So I'll use a star. It might also do ID token or user info if the AAS is also an OP. So requesting claims. So the object here, I've given it a name, a claim sync query object, and a claims value query object. But basically what this is a way of querying for certain claims to be asserted by the authorization server. So we're asking that claims be put in a certain sync, in a certain destination, the access token, ID token, an access token specific to a certain resource server. And then we can also have preferential values to be asserted. But it's really, really important to keep in mind that this is a query. This isn't a demand from the client to say, you must assert this value. So similar to like what Torsten was saying there, of, I want this transaction, I want this information, this account. Here you can see another way of doing that. I can say, okay, I want a value of account 123 or otherwise account 456. This is essential to me for a smooth operation of authorization at the API. And here I have a payment ID with a value of a certain payment number. So another thing is essential claims. So an essential claims, like I just said, is a claim that is required or essential for the smooth operation of a task by the resource owner at a resource server. It doesn't mean that it's a required value, so the authorization server should not respond with an error if the essential claim isn't asserted with those values or if the claim isn't available at all for that resource owner. And essential claims are defined by OpenID Connect, but there is nothing in OpenID Connect that says anything about it, like it's got to be there. It's a required claim. So the draft creates something called a critical claim using something similar to JSON Web Tokens, where it has a crit member in the JSON object saying that any JSON pointer, or it's an array of JSON pointers that point into some part of the request to say that this is critical. Like if the authorization server can't assert this claim or claim with this preferred value, then the authorization server has to respond with an error. So this helps the client to say, okay, I've got to have this payment ID to be authorized. And if not, then I need an error back. JSON pointer also defines how to do the escaping of the slashes, which you can see an example of in the draft. I mentioned these special claim syncs. This third one here is the binding then to the resource indicator, where the claim sync could be a URI or URL of the protected resource, so that you could get claim scope to specific resource servers if the client has that knowledge of knowing that certain claims are destined for a certain API. The draft binds this to code flow and implicit flow, which look very much like what's in OpenID Connect, but also the ROPC and the client credential flow. It also talks about token refresh, token introspection, and I wanted to get to token exchange, but I ran out of time. So the authorization flow, and as I mentioned, looks pretty much the same as OpenID. And the difference, though, is this bullet here, that the response includes the space-separated list of granted claim names. So similar to the way that scopes are returned on the token endpoint, so that the client knows, okay, you asked for this, but you got this. So if the client asks, I want these claims, but it doesn't get all those claims asserted, then it will be given those claim names that actually were asserted. ROPC and CC can also specify I want to have certain claims to be asserted. Some of them can be critical, some essential. So it ends up working similar to the scope request in all four of those flows. It defines some errors. Oops, sorry. It defines some errors, and it does so in a way that maintains compatibility with OpenID Connect, but it's very OpenID Connect isn't very rich in its error codes for that, so it defines some additional ones that can be used. Refresh. I know I'm going on time, but I'll do my best here quickly. You can send the claims request parameter to do downscoping, so to say, just like you can with sending the scope request parameter to downscope. If you've done that and then you refresh again, you can upscope back to your original grant. This is difficult to implement. I can speak from experience. Using the scopes and claims together makes this hard, and policy changes make this hard. But those two parts are left out of the specification. So it doesn't talk at all about using scopes and claims together like OpenID does. And it also doesn't go into handling policy configuration changes. So refresh is actually pretty simple as far as the spec is concerned. Token introspection. When you introspect a token, respond with a space-separated list of claim names that were authorized so that the API can see the extent of the scope of the token as far as the claims go. I know. So so it's in there. The important part is that critical claims be supported, because you might be talking to an OP, an OpenID Connect open provider that doesn't support this. So this is helpful to know that, okay, they're implementing, the OP is also supporting this draft, or the AS is only supporting this draft. So I think that's the point on this slide to be aware of. Open questions. I think the essential part from OpenID Connect is kind of like, it's confusing, and oftentimes it's like, why do we need to do this? It doesn't. So I think it should be dropped from the draft, but I wanted to have some broader input on that. Maybe some restructuring of the document to avoid redundancy with the different flows. How to integrate it with the resource indicators. I'd like some suggestions on that, and I'd also like to talk about the integration with token exchange. In the next version of the draft, I'll write the token exchange, the resource indicator tie-in, and of course the leftover considerations that have been created, and also a way of registering clients to say that they want access to certain claims. So full disclosure, Curity, we've implemented all of this. We had to do most of it because it's in OpenID Connect, but the other aspects like the output of claim names and things like that, we have implemented, and we have no patents on any of these things.
So obviously we ran out of time. We're going to have this virtual intro meeting. Obviously we need that not only for the other topic, but also for these type of things. At this point in time, I think the only question I can ask is, who has read the document? 3. I think we need more people to read the document. So I think it relates nicely to the presentation Thorsten gave earlier on. Do you want to say a famous last word, Aaron? Or do you want to deep dive into a technical discussion about this?
I want to do the opposite of a deep dive, which is back up to the high level view of this, high level goal of this. And I'm sorry for being so blunt. We're out of time. Mm-hmm. I think this is actually the completely wrong approach, bringing things from OpenID Connect into this, because ID tokens are meant to be consumed by clients and understood by them. Access tokens are explicitly not. And this feels like bringing knowledge about authorization servers and access tokens into the client in a way that the Torsten's proposal is more about expressing the goals the client is trying to achieve rather than how it expects the AS to achieve them. I feel like that's the line that this is crossing, and I don't think it's appropriate.
Yeah, I strongly disagree.
We are going to hash that.
We can discuss
that's good. We always have different perspectives in the group, so it's kind of normal. And we're going to have a discussion on this, and the story will continue when we have our meeting. I will send out a doodle poll for dates in December, and of course December. I know December stuff leading into January to see what works for you guys. And we need a little bit more time, obviously, to cover these topics that we left out. Aaron had one presentation we didn't got to, so that will be covered too. And there are a few documents still in the group which haven't been talked about at this meeting because the authors weren't here. Vittorio, for example, his document, and so on and so on. I don't want to go through this. Okay.
Yeah. Quick suggestion, maybe we should have 3 sessions in Vancouver.
3 sessions is not an option. 2 sessions is all the working group is going to get.
Long sessions. Our workload varies sometimes a little bit when we make the request. Then sometimes there's barely anything, and then you get totally hyped up on something.
Yeah, sorry. It's not that you can't ask for 3. By policy, working groups get 2 slots max, so you can't ask for 3. So my kind of guidance is if you feel like you need 3, you need to be having more virtual interims.
I think that settled the TX
God, I should have said that earlier. Yeah, working groups can't get 3 slots.
Couple of spare working groups. Anyone interested in talking about RAW or whatever? I've got a room for informal meeting. That we kind of know.
Lucian, kick us out.